We are joined now by Mr. Rowan Allport, Deputy Director at Human Security Centre, which is a London-based think tank. Hello, sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
Here, not far away from Russia, NATO's eastern flank, we are following closely what's happening at the NATO Summit in connection with the security at NATO's eastern flank. So far, how much importance do you think is NATO thus far at the summit putting on this part of the world?
Well, I think it's the natural focus at the moment. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a steady maturation of a process that sort of began immediately after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, started to sort of tangibly manifest it after the 2016 NATO Summit, when you had sort of including the deployment of the 3 battle groups to the 3 Baltic states, and then rapidly accelerated after the all-out invasion of Ukraine in 2002, where you had a sort of a pivot towards a new NATO force model that focused on deterrence by denial, a shift towards a higher level of force readiness, increasing exercises that focus on sort of reinforcing the eastern flank. Steadfast Defender was the big one this year. And then, of course, you've got various nation-state level initiatives in terms of military procurement, increase in spending. Poland's probably been obviously the standout example there, pushing to over 4% of GDP for defence this year. At the summit, I think they will try and focus on sort of continue on that trajectory. They will be continuing emphasis on sort of ensuring that the minority of the remainder of the candidates that don't meet the 2% of GDP will push to that. Canada has been singled out as a particular offender on that score. But beyond that, I think you're seeing a continuation of a process rather than a revolution from this conference.
Right, Poland already spends 4% of its GDP on defense, but there was a declaration from the Polish Foreign Minister, Radosław Sikorski, that it will spend more.
Yeah. Right, so now moving on to another topic that feels like gained importance, that is cyber and hybrid warfare. So how do you think can NATO balance its focus between traditional military threats and emerging challenges like cyber warfare and disinformation?
Well, one thing I don't think it will do is something that is a sort of a road the UK very briefly went down. You had sort of just prior to the invasion of Ukraine, you had Boris Johnson basically going on television saying that the days of major tank battles are over. I don't think there's any risk of NATO sort of neglecting its traditional defence, its traditional sort of focus on military defence for things like for things that are still military. Cyber has a major military component to it, but it's also a sort of an ongoing process. Cyber attacks continue 24/7 from a variety of sources. So it's a little bit more complicated than simply saying that it should be a NATO responsibility. It's chiefly a sort of nation-state responsibility. That all being said, NATO have just announced that they will open an integrated cyber defense center that will focus on increasing situational awareness in cyberspace and enhance sort of resilience and the defense of alliance members. So while I think that NATO will continue to focus on traditional military aspects, it is certainly aware of the need to do things like disinformation. On disinformation specifically, NATO does have a role to play, specifically with regards to its own activities. So, for example, often you get conspiracy theories emerge with regards to troop movements or exercises or the behavior of deployed personnel. NATO has an ability to counter that by being sort of proactive, transparent, open, as well as sort of countering disinformation as it emerges.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned some of the threats, but there's also there are hybrid threats like the one on the Polish border. Repetitively, Polish administrations have called what's happening at the Polish-Belarusian border a hybrid war that Lukashenko is waging on Poland. How does NATO plan to boost the resilience to also such things as that, what we see now at the border with Belarus, with hundreds of people trying to storm that border each day?
Well, it's certainly true that Belarus in particular has been sort of exploiting migrants to put pressure on Poland, no doubt as a sort of supporting act to Russia. Where NATO fits in there is difficult because sort of Europe has a sort of EU-focused policy with regards to refugees. Obviously, there is a supporting role for NATO, but that's still a kind of a work in progress in terms of how it's going to be dealt with.
And now, speaking of the Polish-Belarusian border, we cannot forget about the military exercises that are happening where China is very much involved in them. Now, China, in fact, during now the meetings at the NATO Summit in Washington was named as one of major threats. So what strategies, to your mind, are being developed to counteract the growing influence of China within the NATO framework?
Well, NATO has been for several years now. NATO has been pushing not aggressive strategy, but a very assertive claim in terms of what challenge China possesses. The declaration from the Washington Summit that was released a little while ago said that we have seen sustained malicious cyber and hybrid activity, including disinformation stemming from the People's Republic of China. Layered on top of that, you have the assistance that China has been providing to Russia in terms of providing components for military systems. Components for military systems for use in Ukraine, despite the sanctions the West has placed on them. So in terms of the pushback strategy, the issue with China right now is that it is, despite the exercises it's conducting in concert with Belarus, it's still chiefly a political and economic and to an extent a security service challenge rather than a traditional military challenge. Therefore, NATO has a role in terms of calling it out. But it's not the lead actor in that realm yet. One interesting point, though, where NATO is pushing back, although not exclusively for the reasons of China's activity in Europe, is it's developing its partnerships with actors in Asia, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. It's basically implicitly saying to China, look, we can put pressure on you in your backyard if you seek a greater level of involvement in Europe. So that's currently the signaling effort is where NATO is probably best placed to focus.
Right. So NATO's partners in the Pacific are also in Washington right now. Today, I believe they will meet with NATO leaders. Do you foresee in the next year or next years NATO's focus to pivot to the Pacific and the Chinese threat?
Not really. I think that probably the trajectory that the US in particular would prefer is that NATO focuses on Europe and build its own capability up in Europe, which will allow the US to focus on the Pacific. Now, that isn't to say that the Pacific is irrelevant to NATO's ongoing challenges, both directly and indirectly. China has a major global impact that it's simply impossible to escape. North Korea is providing Russia with munitions. South Korea is at least pondering that it may provide Ukraine with systems and munitions, and it's already providing countries like Poland Estonia with munitions and weapon systems. So it's all interlinked, really. But I think that the future for NATO is to focus on Europe. One possible exception being that NATO does have a commitment to defend the United States and Canada. So it is potential that a war in the Pacific could bring NATO in the sense that it would be tasked with protecting the United States mainland, Alaska, and Canada from a potential threat.
So NATO must focus on Europe with some exemptions from it. Rowan Allport was our guest today. Thank you so much for providing your expert insights.
Thank you.